Users of the internet, what's the weirdest thing you believed as a kid? Back in elementary school, I was completely convinced that I was a robot. I know it sounds ridiculous now, but my 8-year-old brain had put together what I thought was solid evidence. It all started when I was going through old photo albums at my grandma's house. I found my baby pictures and something seemed off. I looked really different from the other baby photos my parents had at home. I started piecing things together in my head. My parents had always told me I needed some medical procedures when I was little. Nothing major, just some corrective stuff. But in my mind, that turned into something else entirely. I became absolutely certain that the real me had been replaced with an android version, and my parents were keeping it a secret. Looking back, I put my poor parents through absolute hell for almost an entire year. I refused to eat regular food because I insisted I only needed to charge my batteries. Every time it rained, I would try to run outside without a coat because I was trying to short-circuit myself to prove I was mechanical. My mum would freak out, thinking I was going to catch pneumonia. I kept a detailed notebook of all my mechanical functions, basically writing down everything from when I needed to use the bathroom to when I felt hungry, trying to find patterns that would prove I was running on some kind of program. The notebook became my obsession. I would wake up extra early every morning to record my startup sequence. I created detailed charts tracking how long it took me to complete basic tasks, convinced that a real human would show more variation in their timing. I even started timing how long I could hold my breath, thinking that if I could do it longer than other kids, it would prove I had artificial lungs. Looking back at those notebook entries now, they're a weird mix of funny and concerning. I had pages filled with things like hydraulic fluid intake schedule, which was really just me drinking water, and solar charging time, which was just me standing in the sunlight during recess. I took things way too far when I started telling other kids at school about my secret. I explained to my best friend that my parents had replaced me with a robot version because the real me had malfunctioned. This led to a whole mess of problems I hadn't expected. Some kids started avoiding me, thinking I might be dangerous like the robots in movies. Others wanted to be my friend just to see if I had any special powers. One kid even tried to stick a magnet to my forehead to prove I was made of metal. The school ended up calling my parents when I refused to go to lunch for a week straight, still insisting that robots don't need human food. This started a whole series of parent-teacher meetings where my mom and dad had to explain that I was just going through a phase. My teacher suggested they take away my science fiction books and movies, thinking they were feeding into my delusion, but that just made me more convinced everyone was trying to hide the truth from me. My parents tried everything to convince me I was a normal kid. They showed me more baby pictures, took me to the doctor to hear my heartbeat, and even had my older cousin try to explain how humans work. But I had an explanation for everything. The pictures were fake, the heartbeat was my cooling system, and my cousin was obviously just helping my parents keep their secret. I even started sleeping with my arms straight at my sides because I was convinced that's how robots were supposed to recharge. My dad would come check on me at night and find me lying there stiff as a board, pretending to be in sleep mode. He told me years later that he'd sometimes catch me sleeping normally and quickly try to straighten my arms before he could see, which just shows how committed I was to the whole thing. The whole robot phase finally came to an end when I got really sick with the flu. I remember lying in bed with a high fever, feeling absolutely miserable when it suddenly hit me. Robots don't get sick, they don't get fevers, they don't throw up, and they definitely don't feel like their whole body is aching. It was like a switch flipped in my brain and all my robot theories started falling apart. When I finally got better, I was kind of embarrassed about the whole thing. My parents were so relieved when I started eating normally again and stopped trying to prove I was mechanical, but they never made fun of me for it. Years later, my mom told me she'd kept my robot functions notebook because she thought it was both hilarious and kind of impressive how detailed my observations were. The medical procedures I'd had as a baby were just to fix a minor jaw alignment issue, which explained why I looked a bit different in those early photos. It's funny how kids' minds can take small pieces of information and turn them into these elaborate stories. Sometimes I look back at that notebook my mom saved and I can't believe how convinced I was. But I guess every kid has that one weird belief they hold on to with absolute certainty. At least my robot phase eventually ended. My younger sister spent 2 whole years insisting she was part mermaid and would only take baths in cold water because warm water would damage her scales. I guess weird childhood beliefs just run in our family. Story number 2. When I was around 7, I was absolutely convinced that tiny people lived inside traffic lights and controlled them manually. This wasn't just some passing thought. I had an entire theory worked out about how these traffic light communities functioned, and I believed it for nearly 3 years straight. Looking back now, I can't believe how detailed this whole imaginary world became. It all started because of my uncle, who worked in road construction. One day, when we were stopped at a red light, I asked him how traffic lights knew when to change colors. Instead of explaining the real system, he told me he'd seen the tiny workers who lived inside when they were doing maintenance. He probably thought I'd realize it was a joke, but my young brain took that information and ran wild with it. That one comment sparked what became an obsession that took over my entire second and third grade life. I developed this whole imaginary world about how these traffic light people lived and worked. In my mind, each light was like a tiny apartment building. The red light controller lived on the top floor, yellow in the middle, and green on the bottom. I figured they worked in shifts, which explained why sometimes the timing of lights was different at night. Obviously, that was when the night shift workers took over. I even had theories about their holidays. I was convinced that they all switched shifts during Christmas, which explained why some lights would be on different patterns during the holiday season. Every time we drove anywhere, I'd watch the traffic lights intensely, trying to catch a glimpse of the workers changing positions. My mom would find me pressing my face against the car window, completely focused on each light we passed. I started keeping a notebook where I would record the timing of different lights, convinced I was documenting their work schedules. I even tried to figure out which traffic light operators were friends based on how they coordinated their light changes. I took it upon myself to make their lives better. I started leaving little gifts at the base of traffic poles, snacks, notes, and even tiny furniture I made from twigs and leaves. I was convinced that they collected these offerings at night when no one was watching. Looking back, I'm sure local maintenance workers were pretty confused about finding half-melted candy bars and crayon-written thank you notes around traffic lights. During winter, I insisted on leaving tiny blankets because I was worried they'd get cold up there. My parents tried to play along at first, probably thinking it was just a cute phase, but I took my belief so seriously that I started planning my future career as a traffic light operator. I would practice sitting perfectly still for long periods, convinced that this was essential training for the job. I started wearing red, yellow, or green shirts every day because I thought it would help me get noticed by the traffic light recruitment team. I even started eating my meals in specific orders, red foods first, then yellow, then green, to practice the proper light sequence. The whole thing reached its peak when I had to do a presentation in 4th grade about community helpers. While other kids were talking about firefighters and police officers, I proudly got up in front of the class and gave a detailed presentation about traffic light communities. I had created a whole diorama showing the inside of a traffic light, complete with tiny bedrooms, kitchens, and break rooms for the workers. I'd used my mom's craft supplies to make miniature furniture and even added tiny books in their break room because I figured they needed something to do during slow traffic times. During my presentation, I explained to my classmates how the traffic light people communicated with each other using special codes to coordinate light changes along busy streets. I'd even worked out that they must have tiny elevators inside the poles to get up and down, and underground tunnels connecting different traffic lights so they could visit each other during breaks. My teacher was torn between being impressed by my imagination and concerned about my grasp on reality. I remember her face trying to maintain a supportive smile while shooting worried glances at my parents during the parent-teacher conference that followed. The questions from my classmates started poking holes in my theory. How did the traffic light people get groceries? Where did their kids go to school? What happens if they get sick? I had answers for everything. They shopped at night using tiny delivery services, had special schools inside bigger traffic lights near elementary schools, and had emergency replacement workers ready at all times. But I could tell from the other kids' faces that something wasn't adding up. Some of my classmates started calling me Traffic Light Girl, which wasn't exactly the recognition I'd been hoping for. My moment of truth came during a field trip to the city's traffic control center. I was beyond excited, thinking I'd finally get to meet some retired traffic light people who had moved on to office work. I'd even dressed up in my best red, yellow, and green striped shirt for the occasion. Instead, I saw the actual computer systems that controlled the lights. The realization hit me hard. There were no tiny people, no underground tunnels, no midnight grocery runs, just computers, wires, and sensors. I remember standing there, staring at the control panels, feeling my whole imaginary world crumbling. But then something unexpected happened. The engineers at the control center noticed my intense interest and took extra time explaining everything to me. They showed us how the sensors detected cars, how the timing patterns worked, and even let us see the computer programs in action. It turned out the real technology was just as interesting as my imaginary traffic light communities. Years later, my uncle finally apologized for starting the whole thing with his joke about seeing the workers, but honestly, I'm kind of glad he did. That belief, as wrong as it was, sparked my interest in how things really work. Now I'm studying electrical engineering, and while I might not be operating traffic lights from the inside, I do get to work with similarly complex systems. Sometimes when I'm stuck in traffic, I still catch myself looking up at the lights and smiling, remembering my elaborate theories about the tiny communities inside. My mom kept all my traffic light community drawings and the notebook where I tracked their schedules. Sometimes when I visit home, we pull them out and laugh about how detailed they were. I'd drawn little beds, tiny TVs, and even exercise rooms because I figured they needed to stay fit for all the light-changing action. Those drawings are a reminder that even though my theory was completely wrong, there's something special about a child's ability to create entire worlds from one small idea. Plus, I'm pretty sure I'm the only electrical engineering student who got their start by leaving snacks for traffic light operators.